Right. Professor Robert Koons, thank you for coming on. Just a quick summary from friend AI. Uh,
Yeah.
summarize Robert Koons. Robert C. Koons is a distinguished philosopher and professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from UCLA and holds degrees from Michigan State University and Oxford University. Widely regarded as a philosopher's philosopher, Koons is known for his scholarly depth and analytic precision, particularly in the fields of metaphysics, logic, and the philosophy of religion. He's a leading proponent of neo-Aristotelian metaphysics and has made significant contributions to topics such as causation, mereology, if I'm pronouncing that right, and the rational foundations of theism. Koons is the author of several books, several influential books, including Realism Regained and Metaphysics, the Fundamentals, and has played a central role in reinvigorating classical philosophical traditions within contemporary analytic philosophy. So hopefully you got that right, or most of it right.
Very complimentary. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so I was thinking we'll jump into discussion and see where it takes us. And as we
Yeah.
mentioned, maybe some of the things that you've been thinking about recently or working on, we can maybe start off from there.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the AI summary did hit on two of the big areas. So, I think I've been working on most in the last 8 or 9 years, I guess, would be philosophy of nature, especially interacting Aristotle with modern quantum theory, quantum physics, quantum chemistry.
Yeah.
And then the other thing has been proofs of God's existence, especially in a Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas kind of line. My colleague Dan Bonnevec and I just finished a manuscript on the five ways, which we're shopping around for publishers at the moment. So
Yeah.
that's really fresh on my mind. So
Good luck with that. Yeah, that's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Yeah. So maybe we do hear a lot of discussion these days about so-called quantum physics. In your view, how does that relate to the nature of reality? Do you think that physics is able to give genuine insight into reality, or is that something that's strictly reserved for philosophy traditionally understood?
yeah. No, it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer in a simple way. So I know there are some people. There are two extremes, right? The view that would say, and there are a lot of people in philosophy who do this, who say, look, physics is the only thing that gives us information about the reality, right?
Yeah.
The fundamental reality. Philosophy is just a kind of handmaiden to physics, basically. And then the other extreme would be the view that no, we have to use kind of purely a priori, armchair kind of metaphysics to base maybe on common sense to work out what reality is like, and then to treat physics in an instrumentalist way. So I'm in a third camp, I think, where I think that, in my view, metaphysics should be our best theory about reality, and it should draw on as many sources of information as possible. So it should draw on empirical science, including physics, especially, also on common sense, also if you're a believer like me on theology. So as many phenomenology, as many sources of ethics, so as many sources of information we can find to constrain our metaphysical theories, the better. Because metaphysics, it tends to be, let's face it, sort of data poor compared to empirical science. We can't construct a metaphysics laboratory, I don't think, to test our theories. So we're two or three steps removed from the lab floor, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be responsive to science. So I tend to take a pretty realist view about science. I think it is a reliable method of information about the natural world. It's sort of hard. I think it's hard to take seriously someone who thinks it isn't at all, that we don't know that there are such things as atoms or galaxies or and so on. I mean, the evidence is just pretty overwhelming for those sorts of things. So, on the other hand, I think that you find what you often find in the last, I don't know, 50 years or so is people in physics, in the philosophy of physics, sort of doing metaphysics without really knowing they're doing metaphysics, and consequently doing it kind of badly, right? Not without being well informed by the tradition, reinventing wheels or failing to reinvent wheels in many cases when they really need the wheels. And so So that's where I think a metaphysician actually has something to contribute here. There's a lot, there's been a lot of really serious hard work on metaphysical accounts of the last 2,500 years. That's a wealth of information that one should bring to thinking about the fundamental nature of reality. So,
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely inclined to agree with you that we need to use any and all tools at our disposal to try to understand reality, none excluded. All right. Not to say, oh, this doesn't count or that doesn't count, whether it is from science or whether it is from psychology, from our inner observations. But you made another point that physics can be and has been by some construed as kind of unconscious metaphysics. There's a whole bunch of
yeah,
assertions that are being made, a whole bunch of assumptions that are not explicit and that
yeah,
are underneath the surface. And therefore, I think there is that question of how much can these statements from that system, taken as they are, give any genuine insight into reality, right? If I never submit to critical thought, the question of the relation between subject and object, the question of the knowledge of the external world. How do we suppose that there is, or how do we come to the conclusion that there is some sort of in itself such that is transfigured into something quote unquote mental, right? All of these
yeah,
countless different things and physics taken as that unconscious sort of metaphysic, I think does have a limited contribution as it
yeah,
concerns serious understanding of reality, as opposed to what you offered, which is that, using all tools at our disposal and trying to analyze and interpret experience, right? Like a detective, for him or her to understand who stole something, let's keep it at that, right? Nothing worse.
hmm,
It's not a question of simply saying, let me just like look through a microscope and just get some kind of observation, just see something. I just need to think, right? I need to use all clues at my disposal. I need to use reason. That's how I would figure it out. So I would offer that it's the same as it concerns reality at large. There's no
yeah,
simple shortcut. Let me just use these, look at something, just observe something. I just need to think properly.
yeah. It's a good analogy, I think, because in a law court they don't say, "Oh, sorry, you can't tell us about somebody's character. That's out of order. We're only going to look at the DNA,
Only
right?"
primary qualities, only talk about
Yeah,
their
right. Yeah. Only
neurons.
things that can be measured and
Uh,
weighed. Yeah. So I think metaphysics is like that, right? It's a kind of ultimate court where we're bringing all the evidence to bear. And the thing that's interesting to me is that, well, a couple things. One is in my reading of 20th century physics, let's say, the early part of 20th century, many of the leading pioneers in quantum theory were actually pretty well versed in philosophy. I think of Heisenberg, Planck, Bohr. These people really knew some philosophy. And unfortunately, in the latter part of the 20th century, things have become so specialized. People don't have the kind of classical education that they would have gotten in Europe and in the turn of the last century. So you get I don't want to name too many names, but I don't like speaking ill of the dead, but people like Hawking and my own former colleague Stephen Weinberg. I mean, they blunder into metaphysics without any kind of background in it whatsoever and make a lot of stupid comments and assumptions, as you say. So
yeah, yeah. And I think just to kind of drive that point home a little bit more, to what extent can we determine the nature of reality by delving deeper into what can be called or what have been called appearances or our experiences,
yeah,
right? Especially seeing that they can only be thought of on the same, so to say, epistemic footing. There's nothing that has any sort of higher epistemic weight in our experience. So, for example, let's say I want to determine the nature of um, a stone, right? The big stone is just something I see, right? It's just in my mind, quote unquote. But if I look deeper, right? If I put it under a microscope, if I magnify it at a certain point, its status fundamentally changes. At a certain point, it becomes a nominal stone. Right? It becomes possessed of efficient causation, of self-existence. That doesn't make any sense, right? It's
yeah,
like if I have a dream, I am
yeah,
everything in the dream exists in the same way as experience, which is not to say life is a dream, right? Because
yeah,
dream is a category, a subcategory of life. but
Yeah.
it's just to highlight the dynamics of knowledge here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think a theory that says, and then some philosophers and physicists are driven to say this, that there actually are no colors in the world. Nothing is colored. Has any smell or taste, so on. I mean that there's something wrong if you got to that conclusion, because if you go to the experimental scientists, especially someone like an experimental chemist, I mean they use colors and smells and things like that all the time in their research. So if all that's an illusion, you're pulling the rug out from under science itself ultimately. So I totally agree with you. Another thing that I think what you suggested, and that's quite important, is this bias towards in favor of the really small things, right? And so from Democritus among the ancient Greeks, right up through maybe Maxwell and the early versions of the atomic theory, science was seeming to push us in that direction, right? The fundamentally real things are the really small things. They each have their own independent, autonomous existence, and everything else is, I guess it was, people say Ernest Rutherford said this, that all of science is either particle physics or stamp collecting, right? So everything else like chemistry and, geology, psychology, sociology, they're just arranging stuff on the page, but the actual facts are determined by particle physics. I think what's interesting is that the quantum revolution, about 100 years ago now, really overturns that because the quantum world is a holistic world in lots of ways. There's this phenomenon of entanglement where distant particles have a state going that can't be decomposed into the states of the two individual particles and then constructed from them. There's a irreducibly holistic feature to it. And I think that's one thing that any interpretation of quantum mechanics has to grapple with. So that's pushing us in a lot of ways away from that atomistic assumption.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's going to in some great points, saying that color is not real, right? I think that's a split whenever that was made. Galileo or who said that initially? Or Locke, was it? Primary, secondary quality.
Yeah, they made the distinction. I can't remember if they actually said they're unreal, but a lot of more recent philosophers have claimed that actually. Color irrealism is a
Right.
pretty
The
prominent view
so-called
these days.
secondary qualities are mental, not just color, but
Yeah,
smell, taste, basically everything that makes life nice
yeah,
or phenomenal experience nice is quote unquote mental in here. And the only
right.
thing that's real is measure, length, something like that. But I think that's plainly ridiculous, right? We have experience as a whole.
Yeah,
We can't just cleave it apart. Who says that tangible impenetrability or visible extension is more real than color or than smell?
yeah,
And going back to that dream analogy, it's like I dream of something. How can I cleave that apart and say that, oh, the fact that I dream that I can't push my hand through a wall is real, but the taste of brownies is not real. It's merely mental.
yeah.
I think that distinction has been
And
criticized.
then you really get into trouble when you then try to reduce the mental to the physical, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah. Having first of all
no, what
done
in the world?
that,
Yeah, what in the world
right?
happens to those qualities then? They disappear entirely. They
Yeah.
aren't even appearances anymore. That's the position of the hardcore physicalist, right? So it's hard to make sense of.
Yeah, it's such a mumbo jumbo, I think, when we really think about it, right? Like you said, first of all, having made that distinction, primary, secondary qualities, primary are real, then that mathematical world picture, which yields these different terms, the atoms, the Higgs boson, this and that, then that's intra or flipped around, however you would say. And it said that the mind, the mental, is composed out of that, which you got like that, right? It's actually particles. So maybe we have no freedom, and maybe everything is caused by the particles. It's an absolute mumbo jumbo, as far as
Yeah,
it seems to
I
me.
think so. I mean, Daniel Dennett was an example of this too, I think, where in Consciousness Explained, which is a kind of ironic title, because it really should be Consciousness Explained Away. He essentially he says that consciousness itself is an illusion. Doesn't make any sense. Illusion for whom? Right? There
Right.
has to be somebody to have the illusion, but then if you're saying there's no consciousness, there's no one to be deluded. So
And as compared to what, right? An illusion is an illusion
yeah,
vis-a-vis certain criteria of reality, like a hologram. You say, a holographic spoon is an illusion because it inclines one to think that it has tangible impenetrability, meaning I could pick it up and I can't. Right?
yeah,
Real for what it's worth. So I think if
True.
you're saying that consciousness
Oh,
is
it's good. It's a good point. Yeah, it's a real hologram.
a real hologram, right?
It's not a real spoon.
The
Yeah,
criteria applicable for a hologram is perfectly real.
yeah, yeah.
So to
Right.
just say consciousness is an illusion, what are your
Right.
criteria for
That's right.
reality? Particles? What
Right.
what, what are you saying?
Yeah, exactly. And this, of course, this has been a worry for a long time. I guess it's Leibniz who has the thought experiment that if you looked in the brain to all the little particles moving around the brain, you wouldn't find the conscious experience, right? And that's still a problem, I think. The attempt was to explain it in behavioristic terms, right? So to have the experience of red is just to behave as if you were experiencing red or something like that, whatever that means. But that's obviously crazy, I think, right? I mean, the behavior has to be expressing something. It can't be, it can't, well, I won't tell the dirty joke about the two psychologists, but you see where that goes.
The thing about the behaviorist, somebody said, behaviorist or behavioralism is the philosophy of those who have no inner life. Right?
So,
If I don't at all attend to myself and I
yeah,
simply shoot everything forth, then I'm like, well, what does it mean that an emotion? Oh, does it mean that you're smiling? Right? I can close my eyes and feel a given emotion. I can feel pain and pleasure.
yeah, that's
Right?
right. That's right.
I don't need that.
There are people who have things like what's the syndrome exactly? Not shut down, closed in syndrome or something like that, with locked in syndrome, where
Yeah,
they're not able to move any of their
at
motor
all.
at
Right.
all. And behaviorists would have to say, then there's nothing going on inside. But that's obviously crazy.
Yeah. I think that whole movement just illustrates the depths of depravity and stupidity that we can get to if we move along a certain line. And I
Yeah.
think speaking of that, not to get too critical, I better to focus on the positive, but
Right.
today's kind of in today's milieu, the going from some of the observations of the physical world to saying there's an infinite amount of universes, right? And that every second there's a new universe and it splits apart, and whatever the case might be, right? There's a million, infinite amount of versions of you. I think that's kind of like behaviorism in the sense of it can only be supposed by somebody that
Yeah.
loses touch with
There
experience,
are,
reality.
yeah, there are like two versions of that, right? One is the Everett many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. On that view, at every point of time, the universe is splitting into maybe trillions of different copies, right? So as I look forward, there are, an astronomical number of me's experiencing all kinds of future states, right? I think that is very well. Not only can it not be observed, it doesn't really make sense philosophically again, because the basic idea of quantum theory is probability, that you assign probabilities to events. But if every event happens in some branch in this branching world, the probabilities are all one. And there have been some attempts by some Everettians to try to fix this problem recently, but I think they're all failures. I think there's no way getting around this particular problem. Now, the other way to go would be the kind of multiverse, where you would argue that at the Big Bang somehow there's lots of different universes being spit out, and I'm less dismissive of that. I mean, I think there might be indirect physical evidence of that. Um, it depends on how far you go. I mean, if you go to the extreme, as some people have, like Max Tegmark, of thinking every mathematically possible universe must exist somewhere, right? That would be a terrible idea because that would really undermine all of our knowledge, right? Especially inductive knowledge, if that were true.
Uh,
So,
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. But I think too, to give kind of credit where it's due, physicists are not completely making this stuff up whole cloth. It appears to follow from some equation and some interpretations of equations, which is
yeah.
to say that if you give, what's the expression? You give a finger, the dog might eat in your whole hand, something like that. You give an inch,
Mm-hmm.
an inch, you yield a
A
mile.
mile, something. Hmm.
So you give an inch to the kind of untutored, metaphysically, as we said, naive and uneducated kind of position of naturalism or untutored physicalism, whatever we would call it. You have to then continue to play their game. maybe then maybe there's an infinite amount of who knows? They'll argue all day. Right? So I think the buck has to stop at the beginning of saying, how do you ever go from our experiences? Right? We do have certain experiences. We see certain things. We touch certain things. How do
Yeah.
you go from that to supposing that there is an in itself, self-existent, causally efficient world out there, which copies into you inside of your skull, whatever the hodgepodge there is? How do you get there at the beginning? If a physicist can explain that initial step, then maybe we can listen. But I don't think that philosophically ignorant physics would be able to do that in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's another thing that's interesting about the quantum revolution is that before that, physics, the Newton Maxwell so-called classical physics, it seemed to tell a pretty consistent story about the world at again a microscopic level. Here's what's actually going on. We have electrons, neutrons, little solar systems, and so on, right? And with quantum mechanics, all that gets thrown out, basically. I mean, it's falsified. And so now we have a situation where we've got these equations that are extremely effective at predicting statistically what would happen under various conditions, right? I mean, amazingly successful, but nobody knows what they mean, right? That's the fundamental problem. So we have, I think at last count, I came up with 15 or 16 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. There was only one interpretation of Newton and Maxwell, as far as I know, right? I mean, it was pretty straightforward. But now you've got this theory that is mysterious in lots of ways. And I think it's partly because, again, a lack of an understanding of classical metaphysics, truly classical metaphysics. And so the thing I've been pushing again for the last 5 or 6 years is if we could go back to Aristotle and to the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, you get a framework there that's really capable of making sense of quantum mechanics. And I mean, you know, say, well, I'm adding a 17th interpretation, but so be it. At least now, we're at a kind of level playing field, right? Before the quantum revolution, if you said, well, I think there are souls or substantial forms or secondary qualities, the physicists could say, there's no room for that in my theory, right? And no need for that hypothesis, as Laplace says. But now it's really a radically different situation, right? The metaphysical interpretation of quantum mechanics is wide open. And so quite reasonable to reopen some of these old debates.
Yeah, and maybe we could move in that direction a little bit in our discussion concerning those more classical interpretations of reality, and also perhaps trying to relate it to some of the more pressing issues concerning the human condition, like freedom, like morality, meaning,
Yeah, right.
individual existence. I know that you have a lot of work concerning the part and the whole, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, one of the things I've been concerned with all along is having a description of nature in which human beings have a place, right? As human beings, not just as swarms of particles, right? But as thinkers and knowers and choosers and doers, right? And makers and all those other things, right? And so my strategy has been to start with chemistry and thermodynamics, actually, and ask what's the relationship there between those things and fundamental, so-called fundamental physics. And again, I think after the quantum revolution, it's pretty clear that chemistry and thermodynamics do not reduce to physics. They have their own autonomous nature. I won't go into the details here because it's a bit long, but what I've argued is that you need something we would call I call chemical form or thermodynamic form, which shapes or forms often macroscopic substances, right? Like a glass of water, right? The water in the glass has a watery chemical form, and that form plays an indispensable role in explaining the phenomena at a chemical level. You can't explain it all from the bottom up. You need the chemical form as well. Now, if that's true, so if there are what I call thermal substances out there, macroscopic things with irreducible substantial forms that are chemical and thermodynamic in nature, then there could also be organisms out there with a peculiarly biological form. right, which then informs the chemical and thermodynamic forms underneath them. And among those organisms, there could be even rational organisms that have another further dimension of relationship to universals, to reason, and so on. And so there's plenty of room on this picture for genuine, we might call it top-down influence. That is, the whole organism, the whole person, right, affecting the behavior of the particles in the brain or in the neurons and so on. That's not mysterious anymore. That's not doesn't involve any kind of weird interaction. You don't need a fifth fundamental force. It's just applying the same kind of thing we find in chemistry and thermodynamics already at a higher level.
No, that's very interesting, and I think essential for today's kind of intellectual discussions. Yeah, I think perhaps one way to look at it is to try to understand what does it mean for something to be the same throughout changes, and that
Yeah,
could perhaps yield a hint concerning individuality, right? So on the one hand, it seems correct to say that I had the same body as a baby that I do now because there
yeah,
wasn't anybody else that was born aside from the individual, aside from oneself. But
yeah,
on the other hand, clearly it's a different body, just by
yeah,
size alone, hopefully, not always, but most of the time, right? And many other changes. So
yeah.
I think maybe they're using
Probably none of the particles you had as a baby are in you now.
that's what scholars say, right? That it's all different cells, all different particles, this and that, but for whatever that's worth. But
Yeah,
so using that integral interpretive approach, we can ask the same concerning an object. For example, what does it mean to say that I ate the same meal today as I did yesterday?
right,
It's a different meal. Yesterday's meal is gone. So I
right.
think the obvious answer is that it's the same meal if it's prepared according to the same recipe. Any ingredients and content such as is conformed to something that remains itself, that whole thing, ingredients plus that which is conformed to them, is
Yeah.
the thing. Right. So I prepare.
Useful analogy. Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the kind of persistence and unity you have with an organism, let's say, is special, right? So artifacts like the old ship of Theseus problem from ancient Greeks, where you had the ship and you gradually replacing boards over time, and there's all the boards have been replaced, but all the old boards were saved, and they built another ship, right? So now the question is, which ship is the original one? In a sense, there's no answer there, right? Because it's an artifact. There is, in that case, no substantial form that really makes the ship a ship. Whereas in the case of you and me, there's a substantial form, also called the soul, which makes us a human being and which is responsible for my being the same human being now that I was, 30 minutes ago when we started this conversation, right? And if you don't believe that, if you think, no, it's a different entity at every moment, then that means that all of our memories are actually illusions, right? We think they happen to us, but they actually happen to somebody else. And so again, it undermines even the practice of science at some level, right? The experimental scientist has to believe that he's the same scientist he was at the beginning of the experiment that he is at the end, right? Without that, the experiment itself is invalid.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, right? That objects are, we say they're externally organized and they're predicated, or their sameness or difference is in large part predicated on our conceptions and on our judgments. For example, the ship of Theseus, we could say that whatever is in this place is the same, or we could say that everything prepared according to a certain blueprint is the same ship, or we can label the boards and say when 70% of them are replaced, then it's whatever it might be.
Yeah,
And like you
exactly.
pointed out, that
Conventional, basically.
what's that?
Conventional, really.
Conventions, right?
Yeah.
Conventions,
Mhm.
definitions, and concepts, but an organism does seem to have some kind of substantial identity or internal organization such that is different than merely conceptual, and that would explain the bodily continuity and the mental continuity.
Right.
But so I didn't mean to equate the two
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
recipe and the
Right.
person. I just mean to use that as a kind of hint or analogy
Exactly. Yeah.
because but then, broadly speaking, we could say that I'm the same person now as I was when I was born, because there's some sort of sameness or X, such in light of which my development has been sustained,
Yeah.
instructions in light of which my body has unfolded, and in
Yeah.
light of which my individuality hopefully shall unfold.
Yeah.
Now, in modern terminology, the term would be DNA. But the problem with that is, right, that if we consider the whole anatomy to be phenomenal of the visibility of something beyond itself, as is common sense. Right? We interpret everything in light of what it stands for. For example, eyes stand for the possibility of sight. Not always, because some people have eyes, but they're blind. But generally, we see the person has eyes. We assume, oh, they like to see. A hand stands for the possibility of being able to use it. A face for personal identity. Right. So if we interpret the entirety of the anatomy as a visibility of something, not it, then we can't say that the DNA, being that that is derived from the body itself, is that which
Yeah.
causes the body. The
Yeah.
DNA would be phenomenal of that X, just as fingerprints, right? Fingerprints remain
Exactly.
the same. We're not going to
Yeah.
say that little detail causes the rest of individuality.
Yeah.
So I think
You're
that,
you're absolutely right about that. Yeah, and I think initially when they've discovered DNA, some Aristotelian scholastic people said, "Ah, we found the soul. It's great." But no, you're right. It couldn't possibly be the soul. Even the DNA, even if you said, "Well, it's the code that's encoded in the DNA," even so, I mean, the DNA is actually it's just a template for creating enzymes. That's really all the DNA is. So since a living organism is more than just a pile of enzymes, right? It's enzymes and other things organized in a certain way. There's just no way that you could say the DNA all by itself is responsible for that.
yeah, yeah. And even if, and I don't necessarily have the scientific knowledge to agree, disagree, but let's say that's right. But even if later that's changed and it
Yeah,
said, oh, DNA is more important, it's on principle. Again,
yeah,
if the whole
yeah, yeah.
body is phenomenal of something other than itself, then anything found in the body will not
Right.
be causally efficient. Well, cannot and will not lead to the whole form. Again, just like the fingerprints, you don't say, oh, well, the fingerprints are the same. Or let's say there's a painting, right? And you find the same little
Yeah.
signature of the artist. You don't say, "Oh, well, we found the same signature in 20 different paintings. The signature caused the painting." No,
Right.
the
Right.
whole painting is indicative of the artist's uh,
Yeah.
desire, artistic vision, what have we. There's nothing in the painting that could ever, in itself,
That's a good point. That's a good point.
cause that
It
insight.
reminds me of something that Aristotle says about the hand or the eye, that if you cut off somebody's hand and it's like it decomposes a little bit, it's no longer a hand, right? To be a hand is to be part of a body, right? And
Yeah.
likewise, the chromosomes in my cells are not just DNA; they're DNA in a cell of a human being, right? That's what makes them human chromosomes, right? So it's the whole organism that gives even the efficacy to the DNA itself.
Yeah, yeah, and you can't just say, "Oh, here's this little word, DNA, whatever we see under a microscope," and it explains away the phenomenon of individuality. You're just your DNA. It's all caused by your DNA. I think that's again that bad philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think unless you have something to add, um,
No, that's right.
uh, so I think where we're at then is that there's some sort of X. We don't know what it is. And it's in light of that X, again, that physical and so forth changes occur. And that would be what constitutes individuality, the principle of individuality from birth or perhaps then conception onward. But the
Yeah.
question is, right, how do we frame
Yeah.
it? I see on the one hand, right, anybody that reaches a higher stage of thought or self consciousness sees that or can be surprised at his historical situatedness. Right? It's like, how come of all the people that have lived, all the times that have been, I am here now, the given age that I am? It doesn't make any sense. So I think that then gives us an additional hint because if I can be surprised that I am something or I am somewhere or that I have something, it says that I'm not synonymous with that. So, for
Yeah.
example, how am I in this room? If this room and I were one, there would be no possibility of surprise. It's just because I could be in a different room. There's a bigger sense of self. Uh,
Yeah.
I,
It's
that's
an
where,
interesting point. Yeah. It reminds me too of something I was going to bring up, which is, going back to even to Plato. What Plato discovers is there's this other mystery. I think it's related to what you said, actually. So there's the problem of individuality, what makes us individuals. There's also the problem what makes us the same. So you and I are both human beings, right? And so there's something deeply the same between us, right? As well as something fundamentally different, right? And so the problem is how to navigate that, right? This is where Plato introduces this idea of universals or forms,
Mm.
and then the individual is the instantiation of the form, a particular instantiation of the form. So there's a single form of humanity, and we're somehow instanti. It's like a stamp that's sort of stamped over and over again on a piece of paper, right? So the form is the stamp, and the images are the things that it produces, right? So what Aristotle does is he criticizes Plato, argues that that makes these forms too remote from reality, so to speak, from material reality. So he argues that we each have our own individual form. So I've got a form and you've got a form, and they're both human forms. And then the question is, well, how does that help? What makes them both human? I think his solution is that our forms would have been the very same form, literally identical forms, had it not been for the material and spatial temporal conditions that individuate that form. So that gets back to your room thing. So I'm in my room, you're in your room, right? Somehow or other, those rooms, among other things, sort of individuate us as two distinct human beings instead of just one. But as a human being, I could say, yeah, I'm a human being, just like anyone else. And so why am I this human being, right? And that's I think relates to the kind of question that you were raising, right? Which is there's a kind of distinction there between form and what Aristotle calls matter, but matter is not the best term here for this other individuating factor, I think.
Yeah, yeah, excellent points. Yeah, like you brought up, right? So the universal, and that's the term that I was going to bring into the conversation. It's
Yeah,
like on the one hand, I can conceive of myself as a universal. For example, in terms of the capacity to cogitate, to think in general, in terms of self-consciousness. But on the other hand, I am a particular, right? And it seems all the way down. So what explains that conjunction of this postulated
yeah,
universal and of the particular as it is experienced?
yeah.
And
The great puzzle. Yeah, H.G. Wells in one of his essays wrote that no two chairs have anything in common. Every chair is completely different from every other chair. And then G.K. Chesterton said, well, then how can you call them chairs? I mean,
yeah,
the very fact that you can use the same word for them is gainsaid by this claim that they have nothing in common whatsoever.
yeah, yeah. But that also would, like we said, that might be more conceptual, conventional versus as it concerns organisms and individuals, that might have a great
Yeah.
kind of
But
ontological.
even if you say that there's just a concept of chair, there's still a question of, to what things does that concept apply correctly, right? Or even reasonably, right? And so there have to be some differences in the world to ground those differences in reasonable application of the concept.
Yeah, yeah. I think perhaps it's that we can choose some sort of kind of conceptual kernel. For example, the ability to sit, right? But on a particular sort of thing in particular circumstances. And
Yeah,
then you could say, for me, a rock can serve as a chair, a stump can serve as a chair, but it's not its primary role. However, something that is specifically crafted so as to permit sitting, irrespective of its other accidents, color, shape, and such, I would
yeah,
classify as a chair. So there is that degree of kind of conceptual, definitional
yeah.
freedom, if I stated that correctly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, again, it gets back to the earlier point that artifacts like chairs, in a way, don't have the same kind of common nature that, let's say, two human beings do, right? This is why we have a science of anthropology. We don't really have a science of chairology because there's no such thing as an essence of chairs, right? That we can study in that scientific kind of way. So again, it's useful as an analogy, and I know I'm the one who introduced chairs, but and there does have to be something in the world to which we can in a non-conventional way apply our concepts in order to get something like a conventional notion like chair off the ground. As you said, like sitting, right? Maybe sitting for human beings is a kind of natural accident, right? And that could be used then as a basis for defining what a chair is.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. I could just add before we hopefully hop back to where we were before we forget.
Yep.
I think ultimately reality either is or is not given. So, for example, sight content, either you have it or you don't. Somebody that's blind from birth simply does not have experiences that the sighted call that of sight. and there's no amount of talking about it or conceptualizing it that could ever yield those experiences.
Yeah.
Likewise, emotions. Either I felt anger or happiness, or I haven't. Either I've felt or tasted a given food, or I haven't. So I think there
Right.
is some substratum of the given, and we kind of can go off from there. Like you said, maybe it's a given that I can have the experience of sitting, of bending my knees, what have we, and
Yeah.
we can.
You know the Frank Jackson's Mary, the color scientist thought experiment? You know that one?
Yeah.
I mentioned that one. It's pretty, I mean, it's useful, right? So you've got this hypothetical woman who's been colorblind, completely colorblind from birth, and so has never experienced colors. But she's an expert on colors, this physics and physiology and neurology of color perception. She knows everything there is to know about that. And then one day we cure her color blindness and she actually sees colors for the first time. And she says, aha, that's what red looks like, right? Well, it looks to me like to a lot of us that she's learned a new fact about the world, right? But she already knew all the physical facts and all the chemical and neurological facts. So there has to be a kind of phenomenological or psychological fact that she now is learning. Again, there's 100 ways for physicists to try to invent it to get around that, but none of them are convincing to me. That still seems to be a convincing argument.
I think it's common sense. It's a given. If I've never seen a color, it's not given. I think it was it Hume said or somebody that you can infer
Yeah.
it. Who knows if you've seen something close enough and you can maybe think of it as a little bit more vivid or a little bit less vivid, but ultimately something is either given or it's not. And if it's not given, I can buy something similar that has been to me given, right? Like maybe I've been kind of angry, but not enraged. So then I think back, okay, I was kind of angry. What if that was magnified? And I can maybe picture it a little bit. It's no
Yeah.
problem. But if I've never felt, let's say, a trace of hunger in my life, I'm a prince or princess. I've never felt the slightest bit of hunger, and there's nothing in my experience that I could cite such that would um, be equivalent to hunger. Then no, I think it's obvious that no amount of reading about hunger or studies about what happens in the stomach and the enzymes and this and that is equivalent to the experience of hunger. I think it's not up for debate as far as I can see.
I think that's right.
Uh,
Yeah.
Sorry, Professor, do you mind if I pause for just a brief moment?
Sure. No, no worries.
All right, yeah. So we just left a quick intermission, but
Yeah.
get right back to it. We were talking about that experience is ultimately given. I think both you and I agree more or less on that account. I think that's also useful insight. Just as a total aside, we're getting too scatterbrained a little bit, or I am at least. But large language models, I think that's a way to understand them conceptually. There's no amount of speaking about something that is equal to the actual activity of intelligence or experience. So, for
Yeah.
example, if somebody asks me what color is the sky on a nice sunny day, I can think back either if it's nice now, I can look up, or I can think back to an experience that I've had like that, and I can try to recall that. Oh, and what's the word in English if I speak English? Oh, it's blue. And then I say blue. But the actual sense of that is what I'm thinking of or what I'm seeing and such. If I've
Exactly.
never seen blue and somebody teaches me to say blue or in a different language, right? Like in the Jackson's thought experiment, somebody teaches me to slide out the color blue in connection with the query sky. That's obviously not equal to having seen the sky.
Yeah.
So by the magical algorithms or whatever that large language models operate, uh,
Yeah.
by way of which they can yield extraordinarily, excuse me, precise sentences, such as we started off with.
Yeah.
But that does not mean and can never mean on principle that that indicates actual experience or intelligence.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. There's a gap there between, again, linguistic behavior on the one hand, and in this case, knowledge and understanding. Knowledge is grounded in understanding. So these systems cannot possibly understand what they're saying. There's no way. They're merely interpolating, from trillions of bits of data of what other people have said to come up with a plausible thing to say in this context.
Yeah.
Uh, they're
Well,
they're emulating intelligence, but they're not recreating intelligence. Nothing like it.
not at all. And I think it cannot do so on
Ah,
principle. A simple example
exactly. Yeah. It's not just that they need to get smarter or better. No, it'll never happen.
on principle, right? It's like, let's say that, I'm reading a book and it's really, really intelligent things that are written in the book. I would never think to say, oh, it must be the book is intelligent. What does that even mean? Oh, let me look a little closer. Where's the intelligence? The
Yeah,
transcription of intelligence. Right?
right.
Same thing, calculator. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, maybe that's mechanical. But if it's 500 to the 89th power, now the calculator is intelligent. What does that mean? It's an
Yeah,
appearance of mind. There's no room to
yeah.
interject intelligence anywhere,
And
period.
I think Kurt Gödel really disproved all this a long ago in the 30s. That I mean, no computer program, and these systems are still computer programs. They're still basically Turing machines, right? Can ever reproduce mathematical intelligence. That's what Gödel really proved. That to be able to see something as true for the first time, that kind of insight that mathematicians get, there's no way a machine can have that.
No.
Until Gödel comes down and proves something, the machine will never be able to prove something like the incompleteness theorem, because they won't grasp the thing that Gödel saw. I mean, when somebody suggested to Gödel that the numbers didn't really exist, he said, "Don't exist. They're my friends." And I mean, he knew them intimately, right? And as we all do, I think we all know those small numbers intimately. So if I say 2 plus 2 is 4, I'm not just doing something the way the calculator does it. I'm actually thinking about the number 2 itself and the number 4 and the addition process itself,
Yeah.
and recognizing that that's the truth. No machine can do that.
Yeah, unless I'm just reciting it automatically. But if I
Yeah,
think about
right.
why 2 plus 2 is 4, then I would think, okay, one is in reference to a distinction in general, any kind of distinction. It could be a thought, emotion, a sight, a sound, a smell, any kind of distinction. And two means a distinction, and a distinction plus means you combine an attention, at least what's at hand. The
Yeah.
distinction. And what does it equal? It equals distinction. It's a
Hmm.
sort of useful tautology, but it
Yeah.
does have meaning for us that is other than merely appearances on a screen, if we think about it, which
Yeah.
obviously a calculator can have no more than it can have the experience of
Right.
smell, or taste, or anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. So Saul Kripke also has a sort of thought experiment that kind of brings this out as well, because, any computer, no matter how sophisticated, it's going to have some limitations to its memory, right? So there are going to be some really large numbers that it can't add anymore or multiply anymore. And so we could say that it's an adding machine, but really it could be a schmatting machine. It could be doing addition up to that really large number and then something completely different after that. There's no way to pick out its addition that it's doing, right? Based just on the outputs, the inputs and outputs, right? So to say that I'm doing addition, that's not based just on my behavior. It's based on our assumption that I'm actually getting hold of addition, not schmaddition or some other thing that's identical to addition up to some point and then deviates afterwards. It's the actual operation itself that I'm getting hold of, and
Mm.
that's all. So
All right. So, which is again predicated on that consciousness and on the activity of mind. But
yeah,
if we could hop back a little bit, Control Z, to where we were concerning
yeah,
the relation of the universal and the particular.
yeah.
The puzzle then is to figure out how can it be that at the same time I can conceive of myself in universal terms. I can be surprised that here I am as this tiny, finite little creature. Wasn't here yesterday. Will be gone shortly. Hopefully not till after 120. But all the same, right? Why am I, for people alive now in the 21st century, why am I not alive in quote unquote ancient times? Why am I not an ancient Roman, an ancient Greek, an ancient Persian? Why am I not you? Why are you not me? Why am I not, right? So it's the simultaneity of the universal and the particular. And that calls for the question of what is that relation between the universal and particular? Uh,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you want to hop in, but my thought is that the only relation that I can think of is one of knowledge. If the particular, i.e., the individual, is what amounts when the universal knows a discrete kind of a particular, such that each anatomy is the visibility of, that is equivalent, or that might be equivalent to the individual experience. And the individual then is an experience. I'm not
Well,
equal to my body. I'm not equal to my psychology. That's all parts of me. First and foremost, I'm an individual, personal experience. such that the body is phenomenal of. But go ahead.
Well, I think I would maybe take a different tack because I think that this distinction between universal and particular is broader than that of conscious beings or intelligent beings like you and I. So there are trillions of raindrops out there, right? And they all have the same universal of raindroppiness, right? And they're made particular by something. Aristotle calls it prime matter, or Thomas Aquinas calls it prime matter, a kind of bare particularizer that's there in the world, of which there are a bunch, that somehow makes the raindrop universal into these particular raindrops. And that's, I think, already there when consciousness comes into the scene, right? So when I'm a conscious being, right? Actually, in my own case too. I mean, I do think we started when we were conceived, fertilized, and so on. And so the zygote didn't have any conscious experience yet, I don't think. So at some point, I become conscious of myself as a self. And now I'm kind of, as you say, this is really cool, right? I can wonder how is it I'm this human being, not some other one, right? And it's a fascinating question, right? And it shows, I think, the fact that it reveals to us there's this distinction between the universal and the particular, right? And so, but even if it turned out that I had an identical twin, and even if it turned out that I'm in some weird science experiment where they've guaranteed that the identical twin and I have exactly the same experiences up to this point in our lives, so that, consciously we would be interchangeable, I'd still be me and not him, right? Because of the particular matter that my form is informing, which is different from the particular matter that his is informing. So there's a kind of a broader and more fundamental, I think, distinction there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Very interesting. I mean, I personally would just be a little bit cautious before throwing kind of the principle of individuation onto this term matter, being that it does seem to be a pure abstraction. We've
Yeah,
never seen it, touched it, and so forth. We're just kind of extrapolating from the phenomena to suppose that there's some sort of self-same substratum behind all appearances. I think that's kind of what physics does as well.
yeah,
But if we take a more critical look, we see that all appearances, to use that term, not in a derogatory sense that they're unreal, just a unified kind of experience. Everything empirical exists conditionally. So, for example, the experience of seeing my hand from here is conditional on it being this distance. And if I change it, it changes. It's different. This is different than that. And it's
yeah,
conditional on the distances. And all appearances, again, I think are conditional. So to suppose that, what are the options here? Either all possible empirical experiences, all possible appearances exist simultaneously, which they don't. This only exists when my hand is here at this distance. This only exists when my hand is here.
yeah,
Or there exists some sort of, again, non-phenomenal noumena that these are appearances of the in itself hand, like you said, if we want to use that term matter. But that I think has its own issues. We can never, there's nothing really there. It's just mostly words and abstractions. What is that noumena? What are these, this matter? What is this? So that goes back to the prior point, which is maybe the only other explanation of the continuity of objects, including raindrops and so forth, is knowledge. I think Berkeley said to be perceived is to exist. Maybe we could expand that and say that to exist is to be known. Things are known into existence. That is their principle of individuation. Obviously, there's a kind of a major metaphysical assumption hidden there
yeah.
concerning the status of things, but I don't see any way around it personally.
Yeah. Well, okay. This is a big issue, right? And I can see that I don't have a simple like a silver bullet to share with that why that's wrong. But I don't agree myself. I mean, except of course, well, as a theist, right? There's a sense in which I do believe everything is sort of known into existence by God, right? And so then that Berkeley, of course, thought something similar. But um, but apart from that, I don't think that that things out there in nature depend upon human consciousness or even biological consciousness. I mean, I think there was a universe before there were any living organisms in it. And likewise, this was a dispute that Einstein and Bohr had that I do think the moon is really there when nobody's looking at it. And so those seem to be right. And as you know, I reject physicalism, materialism, right? I don't want to necessarily swing to the opposite extreme and say that only consciousness is real or things that consciousness produces are real. I'd much prefer a position where they both play a role. That seems like me more the commonsensical position. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally sympathize with that. And I think statements such as quote unquote only consciousness is real are senseless statements because then what does that word designate as opposed to what? Right?
yeah,
Reality would be
yeah,
a better word, first of all.
yeah, right.
I think we're kind of forced here into a dead end when we do try to analyze our empirical experiences. Again, just to go
Yeah,
back to what was mentioned, appearances are conditional. Either all appearances exist simultaneously, or there exist certain non-empirical noumena such that lead to the appearances, but we can never get to those noumena, and there's logical problems there because, for example, the senses
yeah,
exist the same way as other experiences, and there's a whole salad there. So
yeah,
I think we're forced to say that the way that things exist when they're not appearances, right? The way that the back of my head exists right now is as a matter of knowledge, clearly not human knowledge, right? But knowledge all the same. What we call knowledge, at least by analogy,
yeah,
an analogy from now that we try to recreate appearances on using electronics that gives us fertile kind of
yeah,
material for analogies. How does a Google Doc exist? All the other pages that you're not now looking at, only it can only exist as information. How does a video exist? All the stills other than the one that is now on the screen, only as
yeah,
information because they can't all exist simultaneously. So to say it's not to say again that it's all predicated on human consciousness or even on consciousness as we understand it, or
yeah.
even just that word. I'm not a huge fan of that word, but I think the consequences there are logically necessary for what they're worth.
Okay, yeah. So you've used the phenomena noumena distinction from Kant several times, and so I'm not a big Kant fan, to be honest. And that particular distinction, I think, I would challenge, because I think that experience, including our sensory experience, does give us a kind of access to the thing itself, right? So I look across through the window, and there's a kind of red tile roof on the building next to me. I think the redness is really there in the tiles.
I agree. Yeah.
I think the tiles have a power to act upon me in a certain way, which is being actualized by the light and by my eyes, and I've been built in such a way to be open to the world, right? So that the world itself impinges upon me. So I wouldn't think that, whereas Kant assumes that there's this kind of metaphysical gulf between our experiences and anything we could be experiencing, right? I don't think that I don't see the argument for that actually. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on certain Cartesian assumptions about epistemology that I wouldn't accept.
Likewise, right? The idea that there are those noumena that are qualitatively contrary to experiences it has had, and they have to convert to experiences probably bogus. And I think that the red does exist, and there's no issue with saying that there is something such that, for example, when you put your hand to it, it leads to vibrations that can break a glass that can be recorded by a computer. That if you have this body part called an ear and it's healthy, sound results. There's a indefinite, if not infinite, ground at back of experience or reality as it unfolds with very many aspects of it, needless to say, and perhaps with an infinite degree of detail as well. I think the only issue is if we kind of make the move of interjecting the data of our own self consciousness, namely self existence and efficient causation, into some part of that ground and say that, sound as we're hearing it is an epiphenomenon of something more real. We can say it's a kind of experience that exist in connection with something else that could again lead to vibrations and so forth. Just like the sun, you put your hand in the sun, you might tan. You put plants, they might grow, no problem. But if we say something there is more real than something else, at some point, it's like we were saying before, we reach a point of self-existence and efficient causation, and that is the true explanation of the world. I think is illicit. If we
Yeah. Well, going back to your point about abstraction, right? I mean, the problem I think with physicalism is that it does treat something which really is an abstraction, right? Physical phenomena. We abstract away everything except the things we can measure, quantitatively in the laboratory, and we treat what's left as the only real stuff. But that's pretty arbitrary, actually, right?
Exactly.
I think. Um, but that doesn't follow from that there aren't things that are, we could call them physical things. Like I guess the roof on that building is a physical thing, but it's not reducible to physics, right? It's got all kinds of other capacities, including the capacity to look red in the right sort of light, which I'm tapping into through my perception. Um, and so, yeah, so I guess I'm not sure what you think about how you understand efficient causation. I mean, I think again, this is an Aristotelian term, and in Aristotle's view of things, which I think is right, um, completely non-living, inorganic things can exercise efficient causality on each other, right? The light from the sun can melt the ice, and so on. That can all happen apart from any kind of conscious experience, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's a great point to touch upon. So, kind of the way I see it is that we have by means of self-observation, we can note a distinct relation between, for example, wanting to take a sip of an energy drink and doing so, wanting to
Yeah,
eat and doing so. There's a
right.
distinct connection. If you say, why do you go to work? To earn money. I think there's a distinct connection between going to work and the desire to earn money. And I think that connection is never seen by way of any phenomena considered in sort of a thoughtless way. For
Yeah,
example, one billiard ball striking another billiard ball. We can note contiguity. Again, one ball strikes another one, the second one moves. We can note collocation, things together. You have baking, soda, flour, eggs, and you have a certain type of bread. But we can never apprehend that relation, such as is found by way of self observation in the phenomena. So I would use
yeah,
the
I don't think I agree actually. So I think you should read Elizabeth Anscombe's essay on causality and determination. Have you ever read that?
oh,
She's very critical of Hume there, and I think rightly so because you're sort of appealing to Hume, right? And she says, look, you actually see things. You can see a ball breaking a window. You can see a billiard ball hit another billiard ball. You can see a football player tackle another football player. These are causal relations. We're actually built in such a way that we see causal, not infallible. Sometimes I can think I see a billiard ball hit another billiard ball, and it's actually a hologram or something. Like I get fooled. But in the ordinary circumstance, I'm seeing the causal connection itself, I think.
yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I think here within the framework that I was a little bit inclining toward, we would say that phenomenal experience is structured, and it's inconceivable fundamentally that it unfolds in a different way. For
Yeah.
example, inconceivable that something that is larger than a given small space fits through that space without the space expanding or the thing becoming smaller. That's a limit of conceivability. So if something goes towards that small space and doesn't pass through, do we say it's because the small space sufficiently caused the thing to not pass through it, or because that's the limit of conceivability as it concerns phenomenal experience? All right, so if we again think about how experience unfolds, a stone hits a window. Well, the window had a certain strength. It was the visibility of a certain degree of intent of the window maker. If the rock was the visibility of a greater amount of force than that which the window was, it'll break the window. If not, it'll fall. What else can it do? But I still think that perhaps sufficient causation belongs to causation, meaning will, uh,
Yeah.
and desire and such. And phenomenal experience unfolds as it must unfold.
Yeah, yeah. Again, that's a very Kantian argument, and I respect it. So, I mean, Kant's argument there is that how could we have a priori knowledge, like your knowledge about the hole in the block, right? If it were knowledge about things in themselves and not just about our experience. But I would say no, why not? Why can't I have a priori knowledge about things themselves?
Yeah.
I've got so it's inconceivable that the block should go through the hole if it's bigger than the hole without blah blah blah. Yeah, that's because it's probably metaphysically impossible
I think
for that
that's good.
block to go through there.
Well, right.
And
It's not a
so
thing.
so it's so so there's no reason why causation then couldn't, and it does seem to be it just seems to be obvious that it does apply to things that are unconscious and that are non-living. That again, it seems to me you're in a way falling into the same problem that the physicalist has, right? Which is unless I can actually locate a bit of causation and measure it in my laboratory, it can't exist. Right? And I can't really, and I have to discount the appearance of it. But no, I mean, I see it all the time, right? I drop the dice and it makes a rattling noise. That's a causal connection. I think that that's obvious that that's a causal connection there. And it's not just a relationship between phenomena. I don't think. I think it's a relationship between the dice, the table, and the air, the sound. Um, that's certainly the common sense answer. And I don't see any philosophical reason to give it up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think doubtless there's a ground for any given instance of experience such that starts here and stretches out endlessly. For example, to truly understand even a little thing like that dice. What is a dice? Well, it's a, let's say, piece of wood that was carved by John, just for example. What is wood? Well, it's a tree, and this is the ancestors of the tree. Who is John? Well, he's the son of so and so. And you stretch out endlessly until perhaps all facts of experience are covered. That's one part of experience. Another part is, again, those limits of conceivability that we mentioned. For example, I can't conceive of anything other happening than a window smashing when a stone is thrown through it at sufficient force. And the third aspect, I still think, can only be inferred from self-supervision. It's not that we don't, you're saying, oh, I have to see the causation under a microscope. It's just as a matter of fact that the relation between things that occur, phenomena that occur, if they follow each other, is different than that between a desire to earn money and go to work, the desire to eat and eating. It just is different.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other,
But they're
right?
both species of a common genus of causation, it seems to me, right?
We can use that word, right? But what does that word mean? So, in the one sense, the word means what it means when I think about the fact that I'm now hungry and I'm going to try to eat. And in the second sense, it means that I saw something and then I saw something else, or I saw the die fall and then I heard the noise. And there's different ways to explain the consistency and regularity of experience. For example, occasionalism, who was that Mel Branch? There's different things that could be said on that account that might also be common sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I guess we're sort of going around in circles here, but I guess if I say I made a sandwich because I wanted to, and the fell because I dropped it, those seem to be the same kind of because, right? I don't see.
well, why on a different planet you drop the dice and it floats? Why is it right? Maybe I can conceive of the dice
Sure.
going upward. We don't know why the dice falls. And if you're unconscious, the dice for you doesn't fall at all, right? All experience ceases with consciousness. So that's another factor to consider. And I would say really the only reason to insist on this as aside from technicality is because I think that's the only thing that can save human freedom, right? If we say, for example, at least if we say that efficient causation inheres in the phenomena, oh, well, it must be that efficient causation inheres in the brain cells and this and that. We say no.
No, I don't think that follows. Yeah. So, so just because there's causation out there in the inorganic world doesn't follow that the causation that's involved in my making a decision is inorganic causation. Because in my case, I'm a living organism and I have a substantial form that's rational and that can make choices. And so I think your solution is too extreme, really. You're going much further than you need to go in order to preserve free will. That'll be my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate that, Professor, and that definitely worth continuing to think about. I would just say that without any claims whatsoever, we can simply observe, as was mentioned, that the relation that we can attain to via self-supervision between a desire and its object is different than things that follow each other. Like right now, we say,
I
how,
definitely agree there's causation. So, and I think
yeah,
you're right. I think this is a real problem for Hume because Hume basically wants to say we have no awareness of any kind of causation at all. But
and he ignores himself, right?
yeah,
He
exactly. I mean,
heard from inner life.
his own theory talks about the force of habit, right? Well, that's causation, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't make any sense in the end. So I agree with you on that. I just don't see why we shouldn't suppose the very same kind of causation, and there's same kind of causal relation holds between inorganic things as well. It just seems to me like the natural thing to say. And I don't see and I think to deny that just in order to preserve free will is to go much further than you need to go.
Well, it's not necessarily denying it. I think. I think it's just observing it. Like, let's say that a window. I remember I was on a plane and it landed, and the window. I look out the window and it was dark on one side, and on the other side it was light. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Right? And is it the sun? Is it the window? Well, it's a huge ground. On the one hand, there's the window. Right? On the other hand, there's the sun. On the other hand, not on the other hand. In addition, there's me and my working eyes and whatever other organic concomitants of that are in the picture. And there's all of these factors. There's an endless ground. On the other hand, somebody built the plane, and the people that built the plane had parents. There's again, that ground stretches out. Where are you going to insert efficient causation and say this is why the window is tinted, or you're experiencing the outside as tinted in the same way as you understand why you went to eat or why you went to work. Where exactly would that be interjected? I don't see a place where it would be.
Well, yeah, so that's an interesting question too. I mean, again, your question presupposes that there should be a unique answer. What is the cause of this? But a thing can have many causes, and depending on how far back you go and how many things you include and so on.
That endless ground, right? But all
Yeah,
of that
they're
is,
all causal.
if you want to use the word like that, they are contributory to a
Yeah,
given experience.
yeah,
But I don't think it's the same, just as an observation, as what we infer in our, not what we infer, what we can experience in our inner life.
yeah,
Just like self-existence is a quality of self-consciousness as far as it seems. I
yeah,
know that I exist just because I do, and I can't prove it in any other way. If I interject that quality into phenomena and say, no, the color red is self-existent, or the abstraction denoted by the term matter is self-existent, or the terms that physicists use, the particle, the Higgs boson is self-existent. That's just wordplay. That's all that it is. So I think if we interject the quality of self-existence, we interject the quality of efficient causation onto phenomena, and that creates all of these problems. Oh, well, it must be that
yeah,
the mind isn't here, and the body and the objects. But if we think cleanly and consistently, we say, no, I can't commit those steps. Efficient causation and self-existence, datum of self-consciousness, phenomena, it comes to me. There's an endless ground at back of any given experience, sure. But all the same, we can't
yeah.
get
So I'm
that.
not even sure what you mean by self-existence. I mean, in one sense, I would say only God has true self-existence. But among creatures, I mean, I think the die has self-existence just like I do. We're very different, of course. I'm alive, it's not. I'm intelligent, it's not. But we both persist through time. We both have qualities. We both have causal powers. The power, in fact, I wouldn't be able to see the die if it didn't have the power to reflect light and so on. So it has causal powers. It's not just that it's not just that when the die is here, I just happen to have this experience of it at the same time. That would make all of my experience into a kind of internal movie, right? Whereas in fact, I'm just seeing the die, right? Because it's there and it's acting on me.
Yeah, yeah, well, I think the die exists in the same way that your eyes exist. Uh,
Yeah,
let's say there's a mirror. How do I interpret a mirror? Well, there's a surface in the world such that copies, with its modifications, what's placed in front of it. I interpret this experience as a whole. I don't attribute, however, efficient causation to the mirror. I don't say in the same way, again, that
Like
I
the images
do
in the
something
mirror.
because I want to. The
Yeah.
mirror does it. This is just how experience is structured. This is how I would interpret experience. The mirror exists in the same way as what's in front of it, so it mirrors it. The die exists in the same way as the eye, and we even got a rhyme, right? And therefore, it's quote unquote mirrored in your experience. I think the die exists objectively. The world is it objectively exists and is entirely logically coherent down to perhaps infinite detail, but that doesn't mean that it possesses the quality of self-existence
Yeah.
or efficient causation at any levels of
There's
those.
another thing I don't like about Kant. I don't like the words objective, subjective used in that way for just this reason, right? Because it seems to me that you're saying, oh, the die is objective, but you don't really mean it's really there, right? Not as a thing in itself, so to speak. Whereas I think it's obvious that it is. So
I think
anyway,
it's it
unfortunately, I need to wrap things up here real quick, if you don't mind.
sure, for sure.
So,
Well,
but I had a lot of fun. It's a good,
it
nice
was a
conversation.
great discussion, Professor. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we learned something at least, and maybe some other people will as well. And it'll be great to do it again if you have the opportunity. There's a lot more to discuss.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks.